In this episode, we're going to take a topic that sounds like executive jargon and turn it into something you can actually picture and use: risk tolerance and risk appetite, and how those two ideas show up in everyday decisions. Beginners often hear these terms and assume they are just fancy ways to say how brave an organization is, but that shortcut causes confusion later. The truth is that appetite and tolerance are practical boundaries that shape what gets approved, what gets denied, what gets monitored, and what gets funded. When you understand them, a lot of security work starts to make more sense, because you can connect a security recommendation to a business boundary instead of just a fear of bad outcomes. By the end, you should be able to explain the difference between appetite and tolerance in plain language and describe how a policy statement turns into a real approval, a real exception, or a real requirement. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is to define risk in a way that stays useful even when the details change. Risk is the possibility that something bad happens and the badness matters, where badness can mean money loss, service downtime, safety impact, legal trouble, or damage to trust. People sometimes focus only on probability, like asking whether an incident will happen, but risk also includes impact, meaning how painful it would be if it did happen. Risk appetite is the amount and type of risk an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its goals, which means it is tied to what the organization is trying to accomplish. Risk tolerance is how much variation from the desired level of risk is acceptable in a specific area, which makes it more concrete and more measurable. Appetite is usually broader and sets direction, while tolerance is usually narrower and sets limits for particular activities or categories. It helps to imagine risk appetite as a steering decision and risk tolerance as a lane boundary. Appetite answers the question, how fast are we willing to drive to get where we want to go, knowing that higher speed can raise the chance of accidents? Tolerance answers the question, how close to the edge of the road are we willing to let the car drift before we require correction? In security terms, appetite might sound like, we are willing to take some technology risk to innovate quickly, as long as customer trust is protected. Tolerance might sound like, downtime for the customer login service cannot exceed a specific threshold, or unauthorized access to certain data types is not acceptable at any level. When those boundaries are clear, decision-making becomes less emotional and more consistent, because people can point to a shared standard instead of arguing from personal fear or personal optimism. Beginners also benefit from separating the idea of accepting risk from the idea of ignoring risk. Accepting a risk means you have noticed it, understood it well enough to describe it, and decided that living with it is worth it for now, usually with monitoring and conditions. Ignoring a risk means you have not bothered to look, or you looked but did not treat the results seriously, which is not really a decision at all. Appetite and tolerance are supposed to support deliberate choices, not excuses. They give leaders a way to say yes or no with a consistent reason that can be explained, audited, and reviewed later. When an organization has no clear appetite or tolerance, security decisions often become random, where similar situations get different outcomes depending on who happens to be in the meeting. Risk appetite usually starts with leadership because it reflects values and priorities that security alone cannot set. A hospital, for example, might have an extremely low appetite for risks that interrupt patient care, even if that means slower adoption of new systems. A media streaming company might have a higher appetite for experimentation risk, but a low appetite for risks that expose subscriber payment data. Even within one organization, appetite can differ by category, where leaders might accept more risk in internal collaboration tools than in systems that process payments. This is why appetite statements often include scope and context instead of being one blanket sentence. For a new learner, the key point is that appetite is not about being tough or cautious as a personality trait. It is about aligning security choices with what the organization is trying to protect and what it is trying to achieve. Risk tolerance, on the other hand, tends to show up where you can attach limits to outcomes or to control performance. Think of tolerance as the line that triggers action, like a thermostat setting that decides when heat turns on. In cybersecurity, tolerances might be expressed as maximum acceptable outage time for critical services, maximum acceptable data exposure category, maximum acceptable time to apply certain patches, or maximum acceptable number of high-severity vulnerabilities in production. Some tolerances are qualitative, like stating that certain categories of risk require executive approval, but the strongest tolerances are measurable and testable. That measurability matters because it makes decisions repeatable, which is important when different people make decisions at different times. A tolerance that can be measured also supports monitoring, because you can track whether the organization is drifting outside the boundary. Now let's talk about how these ideas translate into real decisions, because this is where students often get stuck. Imagine a team wants to launch a new feature quickly, but doing so means skipping a security review that normally catches common issues. If the organization's risk appetite statement says it is willing to accept some delivery risk to meet market deadlines, that might sound like permission to skip steps, but appetite alone is not enough to approve it. The tolerance statement might say that any change affecting customer authentication must pass a certain level of review, no exceptions. In that case, even though leadership accepts some speed risk, the lane boundary says you cannot drift into risks that weaken authentication without a special approval process. The decision becomes clearer. You can accelerate some parts of delivery, but you cannot cross the defined tolerance without escalating the decision. A second kind of decision is when you choose between two imperfect options, which is common in real security work. Suppose you can either deploy a temporary workaround that reduces the chance of an immediate incident but creates complexity, or you can wait for a long-term fix that takes longer but is cleaner. Appetite helps you decide how much temporary complexity the organization is willing to accept to avoid near-term pain. Tolerance helps you decide what level of exposure is unacceptable while waiting, such as how long a known serious weakness can remain unaddressed. When both are known, the conversation moves from arguing about feelings to comparing the options against agreed boundaries. This is also where documentation becomes important, because a choice that is acceptable this month might be unacceptable later when the environment changes. A major misconception is that risk appetite and tolerance are purely security topics, like settings you can tune based on a technical opinion. In reality, these are governance topics that connect security to business decisions, budgets, and accountability. If an organization says it has a low tolerance for downtime, it must invest in reliability, redundancy, and operational discipline, because low tolerance requires strong capability. If an organization says it has a low appetite for data exposure, it must invest in access control, monitoring, and secure design practices, because low appetite for that category means you do not casually accept weaknesses there. Students should notice the pattern. Appetite and tolerance are not magic words that remove risk, they create obligations. When leaders set a boundary, they also set an expectation that the organization will behave in ways that stay within that boundary. To make appetite and tolerance usable, organizations often translate them into categories and thresholds rather than leaving them as vague statements. Categories might include things like financial risk, operational risk, legal risk, reputational risk, and safety risk, and each category might have a different appetite. Thresholds might define what counts as low, medium, or high risk in a way that fits the organization's world, not an abstract textbook. This translation step is where many programs succeed or fail because a vague appetite statement cannot guide a project team that needs to decide whether a control is required. When the translation is done well, project teams can make many decisions without constant escalation because they know the boundaries. When it is done poorly, every difficult situation becomes a special case, which slows everything down and creates inconsistent outcomes. A practical way to see the translation is to think about approval paths and who must sign off. If risk tolerance for a certain data type is extremely strict, then any decision that increases exposure of that data type should require senior approval, not just a manager's quick nod. If risk appetite for a certain type of innovation is high, you might allow controlled experimentation, but with guardrails that keep the experiment from crossing into prohibited zones. Guardrails can include requirements for monitoring, requirements for rollback planning, or requirements for limited scope. Even though we are not talking about tool configuration, the concept is still understandable. Decisions are guided by boundaries, and boundaries are enforced through who is allowed to approve what. This is also how accountability becomes real, because a signature or recorded approval means someone owns the risk decision. Another important teaching beat is the difference between appetite, tolerance, and capacity, because beginners often mix them up. Capacity is the maximum amount of risk an organization can survive without failing, which is not a preference, but a limit. For example, an organization might have the appetite to accept more downtime risk to save money, but its capacity might be low because downtime would cause catastrophic loss of trust or legal consequences. Appetite is what you want, tolerance is what you allow in specific places, and capacity is what you can endure before the whole system breaks. When appetite exceeds capacity, the organization is basically pretending it can handle outcomes it actually cannot handle. A mature approach uses appetite and tolerance that respect capacity, because otherwise the organization is making promises it cannot keep. Translating appetite and tolerance into decisions also requires a shared language for describing risk, and that language must be simple enough for non-specialists to use. If security people describe every issue in deep technical detail, leaders cannot compare risks across different areas. But if leaders describe everything in vague terms, security people cannot connect decisions to real exposure. The bridge is a consistent way to describe what could happen, how it could happen at a high level, and what the impact would be if it did. When that language is consistent, appetite and tolerance can be applied repeatedly across different situations. For a beginner, it is enough to remember that good risk descriptions are specific about impact and scope without getting lost in implementation details. There is also a timing aspect that matters for real decisions, because appetite and tolerance are not set once and forgotten. When an organization is under pressure, like during a major outage or a market shift, leaders sometimes temporarily adjust appetite, accepting more short-term risk to restore service or meet a critical deadline. That does not mean tolerances disappear. It means tolerances might be managed through explicit exceptions with clear conditions and expiration dates. A healthy program treats exceptions as temporary and visible rather than quiet and permanent. Beginners should understand that exceptions are not automatically bad, but they are dangerous if they become a habit without review. If you never revisit accepted risks, your risk posture quietly drifts until you are outside your own stated boundaries. Finally, let's connect this to what a student should be able to do when asked to make or evaluate a decision. First, they should be able to identify which category of risk is most relevant and who cares about it most. Next, they should be able to state the organization's appetite in that category in plain terms, even if the official wording is more formal. Then they should be able to name the relevant tolerance boundary, such as an outcome limit or an approval requirement. After that, they should be able to explain how a proposed action moves risk closer to or farther from the boundary, and what conditions would keep it within tolerance. This approach keeps decisions grounded and defensible, and it prevents security from becoming a game of who can sound the most alarming. To wrap up, risk appetite and risk tolerance are not abstract concepts you memorize for a test and then forget, because they explain why organizations say yes to some security trade-offs and no to others. Appetite sets the overall direction for what kinds of risk the organization is willing to take to achieve its goals, and tolerance sets specific boundaries that trigger action or escalation. When you translate those ideas into categories, thresholds, approval paths, and exception rules, you get decisions that are consistent, explainable, and easier to manage over time. The biggest lesson for a new learner is that these terms are not meant to decorate documents. They are meant to guide behavior, spending, and accountability in the real world. If you can clearly explain the difference between appetite, tolerance, and capacity, and you can show how a boundary leads to an approval or a denial, you have turned risk language into decision-making skill.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.